Welcome to Functional Medicine Foundation's podcast, where we explore root cause medicine, engage in conversation with functional and integrative medicine experts, and build community with like-minded health seekers. I'm your host, Amber Warren. Let's dig deeper. Welcome back, Amber Warren, your host here today. I am honored to have one of my favorite humans in front of me. Dr. Brus obtained his medical and pediatric specialty training at Loma Linda University in Southern California. He's a board-certified pediatrician, currently seeing patients out of our Meridian Wellness Center in Meridian, Idaho. And we've just been so honored to be able to do functional medicine with this brilliant physician. So welcome, Dr. Brus.
You are too kind, way too kind.
Well, it was honestly, I've told a lot of people this story, but part of Sam and I's kind of dream and vision of owning a functional medicine clinic with the rest of our crew is really being able to do lifelong care, right? And so I, in starting to work in functional medicine just as a PA under Dr. Eberharder, thought, gosh, if we're really looking so far back as to gut health and, just the beginning of life, it doesn't make sense really to think about having a full spectrum functional medicine clinic without having pediatrics as a part of that.
Yeah.
So, we're honored to bring you on board 3 or 4 years ago. And why don't you share with us kind of your journey into functional medicine? Everyone has their own unique journey, and I'd love to share yours.
I will. First of all, fast forward to when you and I had our conversation about 4 years ago.
I like it.
Yeah, and then I'll sort of backtrack a little bit. And this, our interaction during that initial interview process, and then my actual medical interview. You remember I came to see you, right? Because I wanted to see what your style was.
Yeah,
I was interviewing you just as much as you were interviewing me at that point. So,
talk about nervous. I was like, oh, great.
Yeah. And so one of my big takeaways, of course, from your consultation at that point was you need to fix your airway. I don't know if you remember that even.
Vaguely.
And so I took that seriously, and I spent the next 2.5 years fixing my airway. Fixing my mouth and fixing, the issues that I was having with, sleep apnea and stuff like that. And so it really brought front and center focus some of the things that we tend to ignore in traditional medicine, So I am an import from Australia. When I was 10 years old, I think I told you, you folks this when we interviewed. We moved when I was 10. LA for a year, moved up to Sacramento, went off to college. So I remember during those first days in college, I was one of the first to actually attend college in our whole family. And so I was kind of walking that path alone without much guidance. And so my first love was some sort of science, and engineering, electronics, that sort of thing was sort of my interest. Well, the colleges that I went to didn't have that sort of a pre-electronics, pre-engineering sort of training. So I sort of poked around, and the next best thing was pre-med, right? So I said, all right, I've got to do this. This is about as close as I'm going to get. So down the biochemistry trail I went, did a minor in music performance, and that was a lot of fun. However, I quickly realized, based on my personality, that performance raised so much anxiety, performance anxiety, to where I realized, I'm not going to be able to do this for, So even an environment like this, being interviewed is very anxiety producing, and so went through my undergrad, got accepted into med school. First couple of years were rough because basic science was a time when a lot of factoids are thrown at you just rapidly, and my brain works in such a way that I have to be able to hang those factoids onto something real. Okay, and so took a year off. Went and worked at the hospital there. Got my brain together. Came back, finished the basic sciences, and then went into clinicals, and that's where I found my true calling. It was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
So the first rotation was VA hospital
Mm-hmm.
medicine. Taking care of a lot of the chronic, recurring admissions. Alcoholics. Sad people.
PTSD, mental
Yeah.
health struggles.
And so I realized, this is Band-Aid stuff. I mean, I was seeing that already way back then. Second rotation was peds. Direct contrast, absolutely direct contrast. And so it was a no-brainer for me, So peds
And you loved it right away.
Right away.
Cool.
So finished up, clinicals, went into residency down there, and just flew. I mean, it was grueling. It was hard. Residency back in those days was different than nowadays.
Yeah.
They didn't.
No rules.
Yeah, no rules. I remember when I was senior resident in the pediatric intensive care. You went in and you were there for 30 days. You could go out and maybe get some sunshine here and there.
Adrenal
but you were there.
dysfunction didn't exist.
Oh man. So then I thought, well, I like teaching the other residents, I thought, it'd be kind of fun to stick around and teach, So my advisor, Dr. Ashwal, he's the neurologist, pediatric neurologist down there, he said, you can do this. He said, but you will be much more valuable if you went out, got some experience, came back, a few years down the road and had something real world to share then, So, it made a lot of sense because they were trying to avoid inbreeding,
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And so went out, got a position up in Vancouver, Washington, started a clinic up there. I'm a good starter. I'm not a very good finisher. I've started, several practices throughout my life, as I'll tell you shortly. So met my wife there, Sonia, and we decided it was just too wet for us, so moved out here to Caldwell. Actually, initially started a peds clinic out there. It's still running as we speak. I think it's got 2 or 3 or 4 pediatricians out there now, along with the family docs. Brought a lot of my enthusiasm for the intensity of the ICU, because that was something I really had a passion for, So I was doing some stuff out there in Caldwell in a little community hospital that was, crazy.
Yeah.
I remember having one little 6-month-old, 5-month-old with head injury, with subdural hematomas. We admitted to the adult ICU and was doing every other day subdural taps right there in the ICU, And so staying in touch, CTs, MRIs, staying in touch with Dave Bettis, who was the neurologist out here at that time. And then a year down the road, the folks at Pediatric Associates, called and said, we like what you're doing out there. Why don't you come join us? So, we talked, and it was a hard decision, but came and joined them. Ultimately, that merged with Primary Health, and of course, that's where Pediatric Associates is now. About 10 years into that, so this is where I start things and I move on. It's my ADHD.
Maybe that's what it is. Or are you just wanting to continue to better yourself?
Well, no, it's the ADHD.
Okay, fair. I was trying to give you something to run with.
And so in 2009, took off and started my own practice. And so for 10 years, I did my own practice there at Gem State Pediatrics, under the umbrella of St. Luke's. So when the Eagle St. Luke's started is kind of when we joined on, and so had my office there. And after about 10 years, realized, this ownership. So, and you may get some of this flavor, running your own practice. When you are doing the admin side and you're doing the practice side, it's almost like sometimes a conflict of interest that evolves, And so it became very problematic for me, I would be taking care, putting my heart and soul into these families, and then having to deal with financial issues, what do you do with a family that never pays their bills,
Yeah.
And so I said, all right, this is not for me.
Our
And
training, our
so,
hearts aren't always for the business side
yes,
of things. That's
yes,
not necessarily
yes,
our gift.
yes. So, looked around the country, and I wanted to find a larger organization, a bigger boat to float through the rough economic seas back then,
Yeah.
in 08, 09. And so found the Mercy system out in the Midwest in
Yep.
Missouri. After interviewing several places, joined in there. Joined a group of 2 other pediatricians and had a robust practice. It was a rural practice, We joined on with University of Missouri Columbia School of Medicine, and so we were basically part of their professorship there, so taught their medical students, So a lot of the students that came down were just the brightest of the bright, fabulous kids, And so I had to sort of develop some approach to teach these kids, not only the mechanistic side of science. They were getting plenty of that. How to do the human side,
Yeah.
And so not you can't just deal with just the facts, the lab values. So what do you do with the family
human in
who's
front of
broken?
you,
Yeah, the human side. And so, because it was a rural practice, we were doing everything, The ERs, when they had trouble, they'd send them up to us, we'd take care of them, and had some good nursing staff, NICU, NICU nurses, that were very essential for what we were doing. Then went down to Springfield, helped them evolve a pediatric urgent clinic, got that going, operated that almost like a peds ER. Then towards, I don't know, probably 2013, maybe 14, 15, interviewed with Children's Hospital of Philadelphia because they wanted to get their urgent clinic going, and I had some experience doing that, And so after getting accepted there, and I'll come back a little bit to the, the medical aspects of my journey. Sonia's condition started deteriorating, so I had to decline that position there. That would
You
have been
didn't share
fabulous.
Sonia's diagnosis. You didn't share
Yeah,
that.
I'll come right back to that.
Okay.
So when I started the practice, or when I started into the practice in 2010 in the Midwest, Sonia was given a diagnosis of cancer. Okay, and so from then on for the next 7 years, it was just a very difficult road, and those folks who've actually had to walk that road totally understand. It's the initial shock of the diagnosis, and then of course you do the traditional stuff. You do the surgery, you do the chemo, you do all this stuff. And your pathway is up and down and up and down. But from the start to the finished, it's down. You're up a little bit, you're down, you're up a little bit, you're down. So for the first couple of years after that, she seemed to do fairly well. And then, of course, the metastases started, and the liver, the bone, interfacing with all these different specialties. And so ultimately, it was 2015, 16, we decided to come on back here because this is where the kids are, And so by that time she was having a lot of trouble, At that point, we were already dealing with significant liver metastases in the bone, just bone everywhere, Yeah. And then so I lost her basically in 2000, I think it was 2018. I'm having a hard time remembering anymore with the 17 year. I think it was 2018 in May. And so prior to that, about a year prior to that, she developed a lot of brain metastases, And so we ended up going up to Seattle, and had some of their targeted radiation treatments. So about halfway into this course of 7 years of treating up and down, I started looking into the alternative kinds of thinking, the naturopathic, the chiropractic, got in with some of the folks like Carl Felt Center, for example, here in Boise, and some of the naturopaths that really helped a lot. And I think that kind of intervention really did extend her life. But with the damage that our traditional approach created, I think that it was going to be hard to avoid the inevitable, And so, I used my CME money to buy books. I mean, I just loaded up and started reading, and so, so that last year or so, I was pretty deep into trying to figure out alternate naturopathic kinds of treatments, maybe rethinking cancer causation, as not being necessarily a genetic thing, but rather more of a mitochondrial thing, which seems to not have taken off quite, the cancer treatment community has not latched onto that because there's all the research money is into the genetics, right?
Follow the money.
Yeah. Follow the money. And so then I got introduced to some of the functionally minded providers across the country, started listening to lectures, then got exposed to Institute of Functional Medicine, started some of their training courses, went off and did some genetic studies with Bob Miller, who's a traditional naturopath, and he has his fabulous sort of takeoff on 23andMe, which I do use now in my practice.
That's your tree of life.
Tree of life, yeah.
You've implemented, yeah.
And so when I came back to Idaho, I joined up with St. Al's, and I was there for about 3 years. And so at the end of that 3 years is when you gave me that text or call. I don't remember what it was. And
I stalked you, remember? I
you
basically
did.
stalked you.
Yes, you did.
And you fought me off for about 6 months.
Yes.
Hey, you ready to join our practice? Hey, here's what we're doing over here. Hey, Dr. Brus,
Yeah.
remember me over here in the corner?
Yes. So at the end of the 3 years, now I thought at that point my contract was up. It so happened that I still had another couple years, but I acted like it was, 3 years was up. And so I said, all right, maybe we can make this work, So again, I'm good at starting things. So I said, we need to do this. We can do this, And I liked your approach. We had already had interactions, with my interview with you, your interview with me, And so you said, come start Peds for us. And so that's what I did. And so we have 3 other providers now working with us, and
you've
they're
trained.
fabulous,
They are
absolutely
brilliant.
fabulous. They do their case presentations now, and I'm just so proud of them,
Oh, you should be proud.
And so, so yes, I lost Sonia back in 2018 in May. It was a very, very difficult road, and so it gave me an appreciation for families that have to go through that, and there's so many of us now who are going through that, And it's not only cancer.
No,
it's the chronic stuff. It's so when I see a new little 4-year-old for the first time, and I watch him, and he paces the floor, and he can't maintain eye contact, and you call his name, and he doesn't respond. I know what that family's up against.
That's the kind of empathy that is
yes.
you can't always have
yes.
as a practitioner.
Yes. So, what was interesting to me was the approach in functional medicine is different than traditional. So traditional medicine, you have your visit, you figure out the diagnosis so that you have a target to treat, right? And so
you need a label.
You need a label. Absolutely. So you get a label so that you can, shoot at it. And the more precisely you feel like you can shoot at it, you feel like you've accomplished your job in the 10 minutes that you have available.
Well, that's how we're trained.
That's how we're trained.
Find the label.
That's exactly right.
Treat it.
Yep. And so, as I've watched my career over 30 years now, 35, 40, feels like 400, I realized that when I first started practice, right out of residency, the chronic illness rate in this country in kids was 5, 7% maybe.
Okay.
You know where we're at now? We're at 54%. This was like 2, 3 years ago, and I think it's much higher now after COVID. Over half of our kids. So you go into a classroom with 30 kids, 16 of them are going to have some sort of a chronic issue, 16, 17 of them. One of those kids is going to have autism. 3 of them are going to have ADHD, probably more. 3 of them are going to have asthma, You have anxiety. You have autoimmunity. The autoimmunity in kids has absolutely skyrocketed. Absolutely skyrocketed.
I want to dig into that later.
Yes. When so 4 or 5 years ago when I started down this road, I started seeing 14, 15-year-olds with positive antithyroid antibodies, TPO antibodies.
So the body's starting to attack
this is crazy.
the thyroid.
This is absolute craziness, I remember seeing or hearing actually 30 years ago about Hashimoto's, in adults occasionally. Now I was starting to see it in teenagers. Then 2 years later, I was seeing it in 10-year-olds. And then I was seeing it in 5-year-olds. Over the last year, we've had 2 kids at 8 months where we picked up TPO and antithyroid antibodies. Yes.
So you're screening all your kids for
We're
this?
screening them all now, yes.
Good.
And so now the approach is different, and we may touch on that a little bit later, but, traditionally you say, well, your thyroid's still working fine. These antibodies are only slightly elevated.
We don't know what to do with that.
Don't know what to do with that. And so come back, when you've got real problems. These are not real problems, And so I look at those numbers and I look at the family history and I see autoimmunity, I see methylation issues, I see, cancer, I see heart disease, I see mental health issues. And I know that this little kid, I know 10 years from now where he or she's going to end up, you see. And so my approach is, and this is why I like the functional approach, you see, is why not address the issues now while they're still very addressable, you see. And so
before that label has to come and
yes,
throw the pharmaceuticals at it.
Yes. So it was very difficult for me to actually take these really complicated kids in 15-minute snippets. So you couldn't do that. So I was doing these hour and 15, hour and a half long consults, and insurance was just blowing them off because they don't cover that sort of a workup, you see. Yeah. Not only that, but in order to study these kids, I was getting up at 3 a.m, doing these literal studies of these kids, looking at their histories in great detail, so I knew what I was up against when I actually met with them, So I realized that our current both compensation system and medical record system was absolutely inadequate for these kinds of complexities, you see. And so I just set out to design my own. So you've probably seen my spreadsheet, And so I told Sam when I first came aboard, I need 2 big monitors so I can put this spreadsheet up, you see. So because I want to be able to see all this information at a glance.
Well, that's how your brain works.
Yeah. I don't remember details very well. I need to look at them and see where they fit together, you see. And so, and in the future, when I see, for example, a kiddo with during a well check and mom starts talking about some of the stuff that we were dealing with, I don't remember, because a lot of these complexities sort of start blending together, So I can very quickly pull up their spreadsheet and 5 seconds, I'm reoriented, you see. And so, and then I can advise, very quickly. So, and I'm still using that spreadsheet to this day, you see, and I keep tweaking it and monitoring it and all that. It's not for everyone.
No one's going to question the how behind your clinic because of the result, because of the end result we get, because your outcomes are so phenomenal.
It takes a lot of effort to do that, for me to come up. So I try and design a treatment plan before I even see the patient, based on the history.
A lot of us kind of have to.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to
Yeah.
study these patients.
Yes.
This is a beast. This kind of
So
medicine
it's
is
a beast. So there are two kinds of. So what we tried to do then in FMI was try to take and somehow force a traditional pediatric model into a functional setting. Okay, so the way that then looks is, okay, we have these 15-minute visits, which are your traditional well checks, for example, where we maintain health and make sure that baby's developing well and
Right.
growth is fine and
Developmental
metals,
milestones.
right?
Yeah.
And so you can pick things up, fairly quickly on those sorts of things. And if you pick things up, the next comment is, I have some concerns here. We need to spend more time.
Yeah.
So then we set that time up, and then we do a deep dive. I call it a deep dive. And so most parents are good with that. Some would like to cover all that stuff in the well check, and I do not feel like we can do justice to some of these complex issues in a 15-minute well check. It just can't happen, So most people are good with that.
Yeah.
And so then what is my approach to families then in the exam room, So I typically meet with a new family, and some, I'm getting old,
No, you're not.
and my approach is fairly direct anymore.
Yeah.
Because we have a very short period of time, and I
Yeah.
want to figure things out quickly. So some people are kind of put off with that, but that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
My first task is to figure out whether this family and I in this environment are going to fit. Is this going to be a good fit? And so I'll ask some pretty pointed questions, and within about a minute, I get a pretty good feel as to whether it's a good fit or not.
You have to gauge their readiness, because what we
Gauge
ask
their
them to
readiness.
do
Yes.
is difficult.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is this family here for quick fixes? Are they doing traditional stuff? They've been doctor shopping and they don't like what they've seen and they've heard good things, and so they're on board for another opinion.
Yeah.
So my next question for that sort of a scenario is, okay, so if I were to tell you, you need to feed your family organic, GMO-free, grass-fed, unprocessed, would you know what I meant? If they get a glazed look on their eyes or their eyes get big, that tells me everything I need to know.
Yeah.
If they don't know what that means, then they're literally living on a different planet than I am, than where we operate, and it's probably not going to be a real good fit, because what I'm going to be asking them to do is going to be way beyond what they're going to be willing to do.
Because
And I'll tell them,
what it takes. It's going to
take a
heal
lot.
their child.
It's going to take a lot.
So that really brings up what we have here on
Yes.
the screen.
So then you see, I've got this spreadsheet, where I can clinically track these kids. Then, as I started seeing lots more of these kids, I started trying to create a working model that I could actually present to a family that was understandable. Okay, a process.
Yeah.
You start here, you do this, you do this, you do this. Because, you can give them a list of apparently unrelated sorts of tasks, and unless they have some clue as to why they're doing what they're doing, it ain't going to get done. It just is not going to get done, because I know myself, it happens to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so I started thinking in terms of what we just talked about just a few minutes ago on causation.
Yeah.
Why are our kids so sick? Okay. And the Academy of Pediatrics, the CDC, the three-letter agencies tend to really put a lot of emphasis on genetics. Okay. Well, I realized very quickly genetics doesn't change that fast. Maybe mitochondrial genetics, is influenced, with toxins and all that, but ultimately it's our environment. So then I had to start thinking, okay, so what are the kinds of things that I've seen different since 1990?
Yeah.
What is new in our environment that didn't exist before? Well, okay, so I started counting. Well, 1995, the GMO project was, made official by Congress, right? And
Can you identify GMOs? Yeah.
GMO stands, yeah. So I'll ask parents, all right, so do you know what GMO means? And a lot of people will know, and most will say, yeah, a little bit. So GMO stands for genetically modified organism. And so the purpose for introducing that into our food supply ostensibly was to feed the world, right?
Increase crop.
Increase crop, right? And so, however, when you don't have to dig real far to find real motivation. And real motivation is that, you take, for example, so here's the illustration I give to my 12-year-olds. I say, if mom has a garden, 12 by 12 garden, and plants some seeds, and you water it, and you don't do anything else to it, in about 3 months, what do you expect is going to happen to that garden? Well, they quickly realize that it's going to get overgrown with weeds. It's going to be kind of hard, and I've had this experience myself. You can't easily find where the plants are, where the tomatoes are and the peppers and all that. So you have to be weeding this stuff. You have to be attending to it. Well, now take that 12 by 12 plot and multiply it by thousands of acres, and you get an idea as to how difficult it is to maintain a weed-free corn field or wheat field or whatever. And so, our brilliant scientists came up with this idea that, okay, we can aerial spray these big fields, and the problem is, so if we kill the weeds, doesn't that kill the crop too? Yes, it does. So to prevent the crop from getting killed, we're going to modify the genetics of that crop, like corn is the prototypical example of that. We're going to alter it so that it will resist the Roundup where the weeds will not, at least not initially. And so now you'll drive around the valley here and you'll see these pristine, gorgeous, beautiful fields, and you drive by and you go, you know what, I know how they do that. And I'm not sure that's so good for us,
And so what is that? Why is that a problem, especially for your Pete's population?
So we've been told, and I remember hearing this back in the 90s, that you spray the Roundup, and you can spray the Roundup around your fruit trees and all that. Once it hits the soil, it literally disintegrates and degrades into the environment, it goes away. Well, what we found since then is that is not the case. It does have a persisting sort of a characteristic. Not only that, we are starting to see some of the health effects of that. Yeah. And so one of the more sort of in-your-face kinds of manifestations that 2 years ago, all these lawsuits against Monsanto before it merged with Bayer. So Bayer inherited all this stuff, Yeah. So, and these were people who are literally working directly with, the groundskeepers, who are having to spray this stuff, and so we're being exposed more. And so had issues with, so it's a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and now there's a whole row of people lined up, doing lawsuits, and Bayer is has taken some steps to try and sort of do a class action settlement for like $10 billion to make this go away. See, so
no one wants to face it.
Hopefully, right. But are they doing anything about the Roundup? No. So some of the more difficult folks to actually engage in this functional conversation are our farm families,
right,
who are caught in the middle of this, all right, so this is their livelihood.
Absolutely.
And to convince them that this is an issue is very difficult. And so on my, I created a model, that's this pyramid, and that basic foundational layer that is a must-do includes things like, okay, you've got to eat GMO-free, because in pediatrics, we're not dealing with the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Right.
Glyphosate also binds minerals. It's a chelator. It has a patent for chelation. It's an antibiotic. It has a patent as an antibiotic 15 years ago. Okay. So what are the implications of that? Well, if I'm on a maintenance antibiotic day in and day out on a low dose, what do I expect will happen to my resident flora? Well, it's going to be very different.
Got microbiome.
Got microflora, microbiome. And so a lot of the last 15, 20 years at places like Stanford and Washington University in St. Louis and Harvard and University of California, San Diego, and San Francisco, all these places are doing this microbiome research and are coming up with absolutely earth-shattering findings that what we have here actually affects the rest of us, dramatically. Yeah. So I believe that since 1995, and even slightly before that, because I think they were using some of this spray before it became, wholesale approved by Congress, that so when we measure, we do lots of labs in kids. When we measure labs, I'm finding lots of deficiencies in zinc, lots of deficiencies in magnesium. We find lots of imbalances in gut flora. And when I see that, I look then at the past history on my flow sheet. And I say, all right, how much antibiotic exposure has this youngster had? So if the family is already on board with this GMO-free organic sort of a lifestyle, when did that happen?
Right.
In other words, if it's only been in the last year or two, I mean, there's a whole history back there that with lots of antimicrobial exposure
And
that
it's
we
not
see.
just the child, mom.
So family,
right?
yes. And so, yeah, if it happens to be a young kid, you know that the fetal milieu in which that baby was growing was bathed in some of this chemical stuff,
Setting the
and
stage.
glyphosate is not the only thing,
Right.
I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, all of the plastics and heavy metals, our water, I don't know if you remember 2 years ago, was it 2 years now, 2.5 years ago, there was this study that was done in our Boise school district, testing water for lead.
Yes.
And
yes.
I was absolutely flabbergasted. There were certain spigots that were 100 times the upper EPA limit,
Yeah.
And my heart sank, These are kids. This lead. We know what lead does to a brain, You literally lose 5 to 10 IQ points, over a short period of time, during your developing years, So, and if the mom has this stuff on board, I always say, that fetus serves as a dumping ground for maternal toxins.
Right. Most people don't realize that.
And so one of the key sort of pushes that I have now in functional pediatrics is let's start way back before this kiddo is even born.
Yeah.
Mom needs to take care of her issues before she thinks about even getting pregnant. So
Right.
I send him to Jess.
Yeah.
Say, all right, you need to go fix your issues,
Our women's
go
health
detox.
team. Yep.
Women's health team.
Let's start
man.
prior to conception.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe then we'll
absolutely
make differences.
Yes. So I think that's where the biggest difference is going to be in pediatrics is addressing issues with moms. Because you know what? We're into the second, third, fourth generation now of all this toxicity.
Yes.
And so that's GMO. Well, so you can be GMO free and not organic, right? Organic is the next step. Well, a lot of folks will say, well, that's just way too expensive. It's so far beyond our budget, Well, okay, stick with the dirty dozen. Yeah. You can start there.
Clean 15,
Clean
dirty
15,
dozen, DWG.
Yeah, avoid the dirty dozen, yeah. And so, because there you're dealing with so many other kinds of chemicals. Now, can you get away from glyphosate? No, it's pervasive.
It's in our
I mean,
rainwater.
I tested myself actually. Now, I was about 10% of the prevailing population, which says that yes, you can really drop it pretty dramatically,
right?
But you can't get rid of it. And so now, this far down the road in my functional thinking, I'm thinking that it's not a bad idea for families in general annually to do a detox on themselves.
Yeah. So what's your approach to detoxification in these families?
So detoxification is been a very difficult topic in pediatrics, and the reason is everybody doesn't want to touch it. Nobody wants to touch that.
Yeah.
Every conference that I've been to nationally, I'll raise my hand. Okay, so what is your, we've talked about adults here.
Yeah.
What is your recommendation in kids?
Yeah.
Mom, they will not touch that. And so we've had to kind of plow our own road on that, and so gentle is the name of the game, gentle and slow.
Yeah.
And the reason is that you can do more damage or more harm than good if you go too aggressive, and so that brains that have autism, brains that have ADHD, brains that have huge anxiety, they're toxic, lots of aluminum on board from injections that we give, and by the way, the injectable aluminum that is inflammatory, much worse than any aluminum that you take by mouth, because that tends to be filtered out, 99% of it. So, so we put them on binders, traditionally in medicine, we have binders, you go to an ER with an acetaminophen overdose, you get put on charcoal, right? Because we know those bind very effectively. In fact, if you use them too long, and this is one of the problems in peds is, so if we put a kid on charcoal for 3 months, what makes me think that I'm not going to also pull all the good stuff out along with the bad, you see? So, you know, how do we step around that, you know? And so we've been using things like fulvic and humic and things like that. They're a little bit more selective. But then when you get into mold toxins and things like that, you have to be a little bit more broad. And so then what you do is you have to pulse it, you know? You say, all right, we're going to put you on something that has charcoal and something that has zeolites in it and something that has fulvics and the humics and stuff like that, you know? Support your detoxification pathways, especially if we already know from your genetics that you're weak in that area. And by the way, if your kid is constipated, we need to fix that now because it's, you know, any amount of detox that we do is going to just simply recirculate, you know, and probably make them sicker.
And is that approach working?
And that approach seems to be working, yeah.
Good.
You know, what's interesting is we'll have some of these kids who acutely come in with what looks like a PANS or PANDAS sort of a situation, you know, with twitches and abnormal neurological movements. And you know, that's brain inflammation, you know. Yep. Or fresh onset seizures, you know, and so we'll put them on some of this this detox, and I've seen some very dramatic results. You know, within 2 weeks, the stuff just simply goes away.
Wow.
And here's another very interesting twist: when we take a kid like that and we put them on, say, a gluten, dairy, soy-free diet, which is the inflammatory proteins, right, and the sugars, and the whole family decides to do that together. Then I'll hear things like, "Oh yeah, we did that for a month or two, and yeah, Dad's headaches went away, and you know, Susie quit wetting the bed, and
we're all sleeping better."
It's just craziness, you know, and it basically illustrates how broadly affected our food supply is to our health, to so many different things in our health, you know, and so to me, it's a no-brainer. You know, a lot of our medications that we use are maybe 30%, 40% effective, you know. But when you have something that's like a gluten, dairy, soy-free diet that is like 50 to 70% effective in most things that you do, it's a no-brainer to actually do that on all these kids with chronic issues, you see. Yeah. And so, yes, I will put them on a gluten, dairy, soy-free diet, but they have to be doing that first layer. Yeah. You know, the organic GMO-free grass-fed, and the grass-fed is kind of a natural follow-through, you know, of the organic GMO-free. Right. Because if you have a lot-fed cow that's being fed GMO corn, you know, you're not helping the situation.
You're not just what you eat; you are what your food eats.
Yes, and then you have the kids who just can't sit still, and they're twitchy, and they're hyper, and they can't focus on anything, you know. And so, yes, I know that there's some genetics going on, but I also know when I look over their little, you know, health history, my timeline, that this kid is eating a standard American diet, very highly processed. So processed food stays cheap, you know, because it's production line, just like our cars. Yeah. You know, we can afford a lot of our food now. So, you know, I tell parents, you know, who worry about the cost, you know, 50 years ago, I think more like 15 to 20% of our family budget went to food. Now it's about 1 to 2%. Yeah. Well, that's because it's very highly processed. Well, in order to sell processed food, you better flavor it, otherwise nobody would buy it, right?
And market to children.
And then that's right. Yeah, because kids, you know, tend to pull on mom's, you know, skirt string. Yeah. Yeah. And so, you know, so how do they flavor it? The MSG is probably one of the biggest flavoring agents. MSG is monosodium glutamate. Glutamate is a neuroexcitotoxin, right? And so you have a kid in the brain that's already hyperactive, and then you introduce very large amounts of this glutamate, and you have a recipe for disaster, you know.
How about
it's like Chinese restaurant syndrome on steroids, you know.
Oh my goodness.
And so, what did you ask?
Food dyes.
Food, same. Yeah. All this stuff. Absolutely. Yeah. Especially the ADHD kids, you know. Feingold, you know, did a lot of work back 40 years ago, you know, on food dyes. And when you take it seriously, it does help a lot. You know, it depends on your detox pathways. A lot of the genetics then becomes involved as to whether things work or not. Yeah. When you look at the Autism Research Institute's has a sheet for a variety, they rate a variety of different interventions for things, for neuropsych issues, you know, ADHD, autism, that sort of thing. They rate diet, you know, food, supplements, medications, and then parents rate, you know, what has been the most effective in, you know, helping their kids. Diet is always like 30 plus
Yeah.
medications down to around 1 and sometimes -1 because of the side
Wow.
effect issues, you see.
Yeah. These
So,
pharmaceuticals. Well, and
yes,
what
yes,
I think what we're also not addressing, we as just a medical, arena in general, is the toxins, potentially GMOs, fillers in the pharmaceuticals.
yes,
So it's
yes,
like you're trying to fix a problem, but then you're
yes.
just impacting that total tox burden in that
Yeah.
child or that
MMR
human.
vaccine has glyphosate in it.
Gosh, does it really?
Yes.
I
Crazy.
didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
yeah.
we're injecting it direct,
Yeah.
And then then I say, okay, and then I touch upon a very, very sensitive button and I say, you know what? You need to limit your kids' screen time to an hour a day.
Oh, that's a whole nother
That's a
conversation.
whole huge
Yeah.
thing, but that's part of that
Yeah.
must do
You have it on
list.
there.
You see, it's
Yeah.
on there.
Not just the blue light, which I know you talk about a
Yes,
lot, but it's also the EMFs
it's the
that are
EMF.
damaging.
It's the Wi-Fi router and I tell parents you need to go back to the old days, like 5 years ago.
Yeah.
When we used to plug in the Ethernet cable, to
Yeah.
our devices. That's ancient technology
It's so
now. You see,
ancient. We almost can't even do it sometimes.
you
People
almost
don't know
can't
how
even
to do it.
That's right. That's right. And so they're just like the farmers, with the glyphosate. It's the IT guys, it's the IT
Yeah.
dads, who have a really hard time wrapping
Yeah.
their brain around that. And
Yeah.
so I give them data from Martin Paul, for example, PhD up in
It's out
Washington State University, who's done a lot of the work on what they call the voltage-sensitive calcium channels in the brain
Yes.
that open up, at the slightest provocation by voltage
Yeah.
from the outside that allow calcium to pour in and make these brains absolutely crazy.
I love watching you. I've seen you on the exam table paper draw
Yes.
images of that to teach
Yes.
parents, or draw the
Yes.
methylation cycle or detox impairment, because we have to make it real for
Yes.
these parents. They
Well,
have to see what's going
It
on
has
in
to be
their
real for my
kids.
brain first,
Well,
right?
okay, you too. But you also really help us
Yeah.
as moms
Yeah.
visualize what's going on in their little body.
Yeah. And so when I, I try and make it real for them, because I will tell you that if they do not take care of the EMF stuff, well, here's what Klinghardt says
Yeah.
up in Seattle. He says, if you don't take care of this, I can't generally get you better.
Yeah. There's some what we call
So
non-negotiables.
it's huge.
Mhm.
And then the blue light is a separate issue, affects the melatonin. We think, well, it's, I can use blue blockers and all that kind of stuff. But, the reality is that melatonin that we're suppressing so much actually is one of our antioxidant, one of our massive antioxidants in the mitochondria that counters some of that oxidative stress that we've got day in and day out.
Yeah.
And without having enough of that, you can't get a kid better, because a lot of these kids have these mutations. We call them SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that don't allow them, for example, to burn off their or neutralize their superoxide dismutase, which is one of the sort of the byproducts of oxidative metabolism in the mitochondria, right?
Yeah.
If we had time, we could geek on that a little bit. But I
Well,
don't think
I'm
we
going to
have
make you
time.
come back.
Okay.
We'll have to do another episode where we can geek out on mitochondrial health. 'Cause
Yeah.
that's a really big deal
That's
for
huge.
all of our patients.
Absolutely huge.
But I know you're
Yeah.
really focused on that.
So then once they're doing that, and I will tell them, a lot of people will say, well, just tell me what supplements to use.
Right.
They want to go to the middle or the top of the pyramid, and I say, well, so imagine, if you will, and I'll tell this to a 14-year-old. Imagine mama tells you to go water this tree outside. It's springtime. We need to start watering. So it gives you a bucket. You go outside and you stand there with a hose, and you start daydreaming. And pretty soon you're back, expecting this thing to be overflowing, and there's no water coming over the top. And you look down inside, and there's no water in the bucket. And you look down further, and you realize it's full of holes in the bottom.
Yeah.
You're never going to fill the bucket unless you plug the holes.
Yeah.
So the first layers are those holes that need to be plugged. I mean, you can throw supplements till you're blue in the face. You're basically, literally, it is true what the traditional docs say, you're making expensive urine.
Right.
If you don't fix the
You're
holes,
trading
you see.
polypharmacy that our traditional care
Yes.
does for polysupplementation.
Yes.
And is
Yeah.
that really root cause medicine?
And functional medicine has been, kind of criticized for that
Yep.
sometimes,
Yeah, we have
Yep.
been. Yeah.
So if a family is wanting just a quick fix with vitamins, either I have to spend more time convincing them, or they're in the wrong place,
Yeah.
because they're using that same mentation to fix me now,
Yeah.
so I can go back the way I was living before I got sick.
Easy
That's
fix.
not going to work.
Yeah.
You know?
Pill for an L.
Yeah, because I can fix that temporarily, but you're going to be back with the same issues, or worse.
Dr. Bruce,
So,
we could sit here for 6 hours.
yeah,
I'm craving more information from you, just as one of your colleagues and as a mom, and I know our listeners are as well. Um, I always end my interviews with if you had to mention one idea or one recommendation that moves the needle the most for your patient population, what would it be? I feel like you just answered that in the last however long,
yes,
but
I,
what?
I kind of sort of poked ahead a little bit there. My encouragement for young parents is to take care of your own health issues before you even think about getting pregnant,
Yeah.
because the condition of your health before pregnancy, before conception, and during your pregnancy has a massive influence on what happens with your kid. It is well known that inflammation of any kind, including caused by emotional stress, emotional trauma, toxic stress, toxic trauma, infectious trauma during pregnancy, is a very high risk for developing autism and neurodevelopmental issues as a child. Fix your issues before you think about bringing kids into the world. Once they're here. So here's a little illustration that I used to use. I don't use it much anymore because I'm doing my consults online now. And so, but imagine, your life is like a Y. I say, you're walking along. Something happens at some point to veer you off in the direction of your straight walk up in one direction. Okay. And usually it's some, I don't know, infection, or it's some trauma, or something happens, okay? You can pick it up on a lab, you can pick it up on symptoms or whatever. The sooner you recognize what's happening and fix the triggers and move back to the straight line or to the other fork in the Y, the shorter the distance is. The farther you let that go, the farther that distance is between the two legs, and the longer it takes, if you can even get there, you see.
Backtrack.
And so the closest point to that initial event is before you even get, before you even
Before you
conceive.
veer, yeah. Yeah.
Before you even conceive.
Yeah.
So if you can go way, way back, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing will go away. Now, once you're here, then I would say you've got to be doing that first line.
Yep.
You got to be watching what the kids are doing online, how much blue light exposure, how much EMF exposure. You've got to be watching what they're eating. You got to be filtering your water. The absolute basic things, that are they're so different than they were 30, 35 years ago.
Unfortunately,
I say we need to go back to living the way we were living pre-1990.
For so many reasons.
With the, we can learn how to use current technology safely.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say because you can be a road statistic to not drive your car. Right. I will say you need to wear your seatbelt, obey the traffic lights, and don't drive drunk. Right. I'm not saying you get rid of your devices. I'm saying hardwire them. Yeah. Limit the time.
Be aware.
Be aware.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's such good advice. Thank you so much, Dr. Bruce, for your time. We're excited to have you on. Thank you for listening to the Functional Medicine Foundation's podcast. For more information on topics covered today, programs offered at FMF, and the highest quality of supplements, and more, go to funmedfoundations.com.